there was a sense of optimism among both sets of supporters. And I think when Pennsylvania was called for Donald Trump in the very early hours of the morning here, that really felt like the moment that things shifted and changed. His supporters are absolutely jubilant today, particularly in those key swing states. They feel that they worked incredibly hard. They feel that the message that they were getting out, particularly on the economy, was going to resonate, and it's been proved now that it did.
And yet again, it came down to those key swing states, and he swept the board.
He did. And again, I think even this time yesterday, speaking to supporters on both sides, they both fully believed it was in touching distance. They really did, with the efforts and the energies that they put into those key swing states. And I think there was a genuine belief among both camps that it was actually closer than the results that we're seeing so far actually bear out. I think they really thought, and particularly Kamala Harris's team, they had a real sense of positivity. They felt that they were moving the dial, and we saw that, didn't we, sort of slip away as the night went on, when she cancelled her planned appearance at the rally, when she said that she wouldn't be coming out and speaking today. And, we saw the mood and the tone in those two camps. But I think what is really interesting as well is how people will react to this, again, in those key swing states that you're talking about. Because when we got the exit poll data, which looks very much at trends, at how people feel, not necessarily just who they voted for, we actually saw from both sides that this real sense of fear and nervousness about what would happen if the other side win. And I think you saw it in that speech that Donald Trump made this morning, where he talked about healing the country. I think there's this real schism, this fear that politics once again has opened up a huge divide across America, and something now needs to be done to pull people back together, particularly as they wake up to this result this morning.
And no question of his legitimacy this time around either, because he's taken, by some margin, the popular vote as well.
Indeed. And, even yesterday, the pitch was being rolled, as we say, for those messages. In one particular county, Cambria County in Pennsylvania, they had a problem with the voting machines. And then we started to get those messages, again, coming from the Trump camp, this line, stay in line, stay in line. If you're being asked to leave, if you're being told there isn't time to vote, stay in line. And I think it felt a moment where, depending on how the dial moved over the next few hours, they were preparing the ground, I think, for a possible
offer very different visions of the future for America in the world. What do you think, in the end, saw in Donald Trump?
I think for many people here, it came down to the economy. And that was a message that he talked about a lot. There were really two key messages for the domestic audience. And sometimes America's place in the world did come into it. But for the US domestic voters, it was very much about the economy. And there is no doubt that people here, ordinary working Americans, very much his base, and particularly in those more rural areas, feel worse off than they did under his last presidency. They see things like the price of gas to fill their car costing more. They see their wages not going as far. Now, not all of that, of course, was in the gift of Joe Biden and the Democrats. A lot of that is to do with the shifting sort of way that the world economy works. But he really tapped into something where people did remember better times under him. And I think when it comes down to it all, ultimately all of those push-pull factors, the drivers about what people say, the personality politics, ultimately things like the economy, those key topics, will always be the one that, when somebody's finger is hovering over the button at the electronic voting machine, the thing that will clarify what they want to do. And I think that was very much a key factor in this case.
Anna Foster in that key swing state of Pennsylvania. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. A reminder of the main news. Donald Trump has won a second term in the White House, and his Republican Party has taken the Senate and may retain control of the House of Representatives. Mr. Trump now says he has an unprecedented mandate and has promised immediate action on the economy and on migration. More globally, China has said it will continue to work with the US on the basis of mutual respect. A Foreign Ministry spokesperson at a regular news conference said the relationship would continue in accordance with the principles of peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation. For more on what Donald Trump's victory might mean for relations with China and the rest of the region. Our Asia-Pacific regional editor, Celia Hatton, joins me in the studio. Celia, let's start with China. What's the reaction there beyond what we just heard?
Well, you mentioned the idea of win-win cooperation, but actually I think there's a lot of fear in Beijing right now. The top body of Chinese leaders is actually meeting behind closed doors this week to try to settle on an economic stimulus package to help China's ailing economy. And they've let it be widely known that they had two proposals planned. One if Harris won, one if Trump won. Now that Trump's won, it's widely expected that they're going to unleash a really big stimulus package to try to boost the Chinese economy. And that's, in theory, to counter what Donald Trump has said he wants to do. On the campaign trail, he let it be known that he was a big fan of tariffs, especially on Chinese products. And he said he wanted to put tariffs of up to 60% on Chinese products.
And these are key things, aren't they? Like electric vehicles, which China's future sort of depends on.
Exactly. So he's really talked about, he hasn't said which tariffs will go on which products, but we're expecting that some products will get tariffs of up to 60%, but many products, even just the cheapest Chinese things, will get tariffs of up to 20%. And so that's led a lot of people worry about the Chinese economy and how they're going to counter that. Now, politically, we're also seeing how China's reacting to this. Officially, they've had no comment specifically on a Trump victory. But we're already seeing Chinese diplomats deploying the same strategy that we saw in the last Trump presidency. So you read some of the comments from the foreign ministry today saying that it was a win-win, that they were looking forward to working with whoever won the election. But we've also heard them talking about portraying China as the stable alternative to the United States. So, for example, the foreign ministry announced today that leaders from Italy and Indonesia were visiting China this week, saying that that underscores the recognition of China as a guardian of stability. So we're going to expect Beijing to really try to fill the vacuum that the United States might leave if it adopts a more isolationist policy, the way that it did under the last Trump presidency. We're going to expect to try to fill that space and to try to drive a wedge between the United States and some of its more traditional allies, for example, the EU.
What about North Korea? Trump had an interesting relationship there in his last term.
That's right. So we've heard in July that North Korea said they really didn't care who won the presidency. But then we heard in August from a very high-profile diplomat who defected, saying that Kim Jong-un actually would be interested in restarting talks with Donald Trump. I think the answer is that it really is very unpredictable what Donald Trump will do with North Korea. He once famously threatened fire and fury to North Korea, but then he sat down for talks. So it's very uncertain, and I think that's how the region's feeling right now. We don't know whether Donald Trump will side with United States' traditional allies like South Korea and Japan, or whether he'll start dealing with other countries that the United States has really been ignoring for the past few years. Countries like Indonesia, which has just has a new leader, or North Korea. Maybe he'll start to restart talks with them.
Our Asia-Pacific editor, Celia Hatton. So, what will the Kremlin make of a second Donald Trump presidency? Will Russia feel emboldened to try to defeat Ukraine, or will peace come in a matter of days, as Mr. Trump has promised? Maria Butina is a Russian politician and former entrepreneur who was convicted in 2018 of acting as an unregistered foreign agent in Russia and within the United States. Of Russia within the United States. What does she think about Donald Trump's comments about ending the war in Ukraine quickly?
Russia is very open and ready to negotiate with Ukraine and with all the parties who are involved in this conflict today. So we can greet their desire of him to be a peacemaker. That's wonderful. Everybody wants peace.
Maria Butina. Let's speak to Vitaly Shevchenko, who is the Russia editor at BBC Monitoring. Vitaly, Donald Trump says he respects Vladimir Putin. Is that mutual? What can we expect?
It's difficult to expect a former KGB officer to have much respect, I'll put it this way, for the leader of a country which he sees as the main adversary. But there are things that are on the surface, and there are things that emerge if you scratch the surface. So officially, and this is the line that's been pushed by state media in Russia, Russia is prepared to work with whoever wins the election. It's about time constructive dialogue restarted. But if you look between the lines, if you scratch that surface, I can detect a feeling of jubilation, happiness, hooray. For example, Maria Zakharova, the spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, this morning she quoted from Kamala Harris, who in turn quoted from the Bible. And the quote was about laughter and happiness that comes in the morning. So Maria Zakharova strongly suggested that now's the time for laughter and happiness, and she said, Hallelujah. So that reveals a certain happiness in the Kremlin about Donald Trump's victory. But then again, Donald Trump is hardly a predictable player. And this morning, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has been speaking about it. And again, he reiterated the line about working with the new US president. But there's a certain circumspection. Let's wait and see what kind of policies Donald Trump is going to pursue. All accusations of Russia meddling in US elections on behalf of either candidate are strongly rejected by Moscow. But what we're hearing from Moscow is that, okay, we'll have to wait and see. But underneath that surface, there's a certain happiness.
Is this bad news for Ukraine?
That's what I'm reading in Ukrainian media. That's what I'm hearing from people commenting in Ukraine. I've not heard or seen any Ukrainian who wants Ukraine to survive, let alone win this war, who would say, I'm so happy that Donald Trump won. There's a certain resignation, there's a certain acceptance of the fact that Donald Trump's won. His rhetoric has strongly suggested that a dramatic decrease in US assistance to Ukraine is a possibility. And Ukrainians know how dependent they are on this assistance. They know that without it, Ukraine will have a minuscule chance of surviving this war. So they fear the worst, but they hope for the best.
Vitaly Shevchenko. The US dollar surged as news emerged that Donald Trump was winning the White House. Bitcoin is also at a record high as traders bet on an easier regulatory environment for cryptocurrency. Europe's main stock markets rallied at the start of trade. Paris and Frankfurt all rose by about 1%, while the dollar has gone up against the pound and the euro. I asked the BBC's economics editor Faisal Islam why the markets had reacted in this way.
I think it's the absence of what they predicted in a way, which was that this uncertainty would go on for some time to come. And it's all been settled far more quickly than most of the popular wisdom had it, that we'd be going through days of uncertainty and recounted votes and legal challenges and the like. That's all been settled far more quickly than expected. There's also the prospect of unified government. I'm not sure about that in terms of what happens in the House of Representatives, but you certainly have a clear direction with some of the absence, if you like, of likely or possible social unrest that was feared. But now there's lots of focus perhaps on what was less focused upon, which is exactly what a President Trump in his second term will do, not just as regards the US economy, which was clearly a fundamental factor in his second election, but also in the knock-on impact of some of these policies on global economics, which I would submit to you will be profound and have capital cities all around the world kind of running to work out what the consequences will be, not just intended, but unintended too, about having the world's biggest economy go down a rather different economic path.
Yeah, what are the main concerns from those who are worried about a Trump presidency?
Let's do the markets first. And the bipartisan analysts of the US deficits, looked at both candidates' plans and said that both would increase borrowing by some amount. And this is against the context of a significant increase in US borrowing already and relatively large deficits going on for decades. On top of that now, the new American President-elect Trump, is predicted to add $8 trillion to the US debt with his sort of slew of mainly corporate tax cuts. So That has affected US borrowing rates. We've seen those go up. When they go up, they kind of affect everybody. They affect the UK, for example, significantly. Will there be some sort of Federal Reserve response to that in terms of interest rates, which also affect the whole world? Now, the contrary argument here is something, again, that was not particularly well defined, but maybe we should take much more seriously than seemed at the time, which was that President Trump will get the likes of Elon Musk in for a Department of Government Efficiency and somehow cut $2 trillion out of US bureaucracy, because that's what he's promised. And if that happens, that will be quite something.
The BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam. So, how did Donald Trump win this election, and what will he do on the world stage? The BBC's North America correspondent, Anthony Zerka, is in Washington.
In close elections, you do tend to see things break one way or the other. They don't necessarily come down like a set of matchsticks all in different directions. And I think that is what we have seen, not just in the swing states, but across the map of the United States. Donald Trump surpassing his margins in 2020 and recreating an America that looks much more like that 2016 election.
President Zelensky of Ukraine has just said he hopes that a Trump victory will bring a just peace in Ukraine closer. What can we say about what Donald Trump might now do?
The only thing that Donald Trump has really said about Ukraine is that he would end the war in a day. So now we're going to have to see how he actually plans to go about doing that. But I think it would be a peace, if there is a peace, that is one that is more sympathetic towards Russia than Ukraine, just judging on Donald Trump's rhetoric and the fact that if there's going to be an immediate peace, it would have to be one that Ukraine may not like and might require giving up territory.
And on Gaza and Israel, he has said, hasn't he, that he wants the war there to finish quickly. But again, an absence of detail.
Yeah, exactly. And he, according to the Israelis, he called to congratulate Israel on its military operations in Lebanon. So this is not the kind of view that would lead one to predict that if the war ends quickly, it's going to end in a way that the Palestinians want or surrounding Arab nations want. He can exert pressure, and that pressure may be to encourage Israel or support Israel in even more aggressive military operations, and that's the way it ends.
Meanwhile, for the Democrats, some bloodletting, one assumes. I mean, Kamala Harris will speak eventually, and obviously she will certify the result as vice president, and there isn't going to be any effort to challenge Donald Trump on any front. He has plainly won. But, and we heard from a Democratic consultant, someone who's campaigned alongside Kamala Harris an hour or so ago, that actually she'd made the wrong vice presidential pick. She should have picked the governor of Pennsylvania and might, through that, have won votes that she did. I mean, there is going to be a considerable fallout, to put it mildly.
There's going to be a circular firing squad.
And against Joe Biden, actually, as well.
That was what I was about to say. I think the knives are going to come out for Joe Biden. The blame is going to be placed squarely on Joe Biden for not relinquishing the reins of power and abandoning his reelection bid much, much earlier. That would have allowed a more robust primary process where someone could build a campaign up and introduce themselves to the American public on a longer time frame than Kamala Harris had. I think, at least at the moment, Democrats look at Kamala Harris's campaign, have said that she ran a fairly effective one, that she played a bad hand about as best as she could. She had a clear campaign message. She did well in the debate. Maybe she didn't pick the right vice presidential running mate, but this was such a solid win for Donald Trump that Josh Shapiro, even if he delivered Pennsylvania, and he may not have been able to, that wouldn't have turned some of these other battleground states around. So the second guessing with her may not be as pronounced as what's coming for Joe Biden, because this was the bed he made, and now Democrats are sleeping in it.
Anthony Zerka speaking to Justin Webb. This is an extended edition of the Newsroom on the day Donald Trump won the US election. He is on course to make a historic return to the White House. The Republican told jubilant crowds in Florida, America has given us an unprecedented and powerful mandate. Republicans have also taken the Senate back from the Democrats after flipping a string of seats. Plenty more still to come.
This is the BBC World Service with the story of a global icon in women's football.
People would come to me and say, "It's a boys' sport. You have to play with a doll." I simply let them talk. That motivated me.
She's a Brazilian phenomenon. Even her opponents love her. She's a player who has changed the women's game. She is Marta. I'm Julia Carneiro with the story of the most famous women's footballer in the world.
When I started playing, I didn't have a female idol. Today, people stop and say, "Oh, my daughter loves you. She wants to be just like you." We have become a reference for many women all over the world.
You can't teach football. It's a gift. She started hitting the ball. The first, second and third time, you already know that she has a gift.
Marta, Brazil's global icon. Saturday at 18:30 GMT.
You're listening to an extended edition of the Newsroom after Donald Trump's historic victory in the US presidential election. In the next half hour, we'll get reaction from Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East, including Israel, from America's NATO partners in Europe and from Latin America, where Mr. Trump has promised to tackle illegal migration. US, and we'll discuss the likely effects of a second Trump presidency on efforts to combat global warming. That's all after a summary of the latest world news.
BBC News with Moira Alderson. Donald Trump is returning to the White House for a second term. Victories in Alaska and Wisconsin gave him the majority he needs in the Electoral College. He also won the popular vote. Mr. Trump has said he now has an unprecedented mandate and that he would lead America to what he called a new golden age. His Republican Party is projected to take control of the Senate. It's also gained seats in the House of Representatives, although the final results aren't yet clear. Controlling both houses would give Mr. Trump a chance to enact most of his agenda. The Democratic candidate Kamala Harris has not commented on the results. Right-wing leaders have welcomed Mr. Trump's projected victory. The Israeli Prime Minister described it as a new beginning, but there's been a more cautious reaction from others. President Zelensky said he hoped Mr. Trump would work to bring a just peace for Ukraine. Moscow said it had no plans to congratulate Mr. Trump. In many states, Americans also voted on abortion. 7 states backed protecting or expanding the right to terminations, but fuller rights were rejected in Florida, Nebraska, and in South Dakota, which will maintain a near-total ban. Interpol says hundreds of people have been arrested in its largest ever operation against human trafficking. Some 3,000 potential victims were rescued in more than 100 countries and territories. The United Nations says there's been a marked increase in opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan. However, production is still lower than before the Taliban takeover. More than 100 patients are due to be moved from Gaza in a rare medical evacuation coordinated by the WHO. Thousands more are awaiting evacuation, but fewer than 300 have been allowed to leave since May. Most of today's evacuees are heading for the UAE. BBC News.
This is an extended edition of the Newsroom with me, Alex Ritson. On the day Donald Trump won the US election, he is on course to make a historic return to the White House for a second term. And capitals around the world, both hostile and friendly to the United States, have been weighing up what a second Trump White House administration would mean for their respective national interests and for the most pressing global security threats. I've been getting the thoughts of the diplomatic and defence analyst Jonathan Marcus.
I think certainly, first of all, it's very bad news for America's allies. I think it's a temptation, obviously, in journalism to kind of have instant history. Everything is of epochal proportions. But I do think that this is a very significant moment. I think when historians look back, if Mr. Trump is as bad and as dangerous as potentially he could be to the international order, I think historians will look back at this day and say it was when the post-1945 world order, the order that America established at the end of the Second World War, which key economic and security dimensions, it was the start of that order unraveling. And I think in terms of their worst fears, that's something that many of America's allies are worried about.
I mean, it's reality now. They've got to get used to it. How could his second administration differ from the first?
Well, look, first of all, there's the context. We have major war in Europe. We have an ever-widening crisis in the Middle East with appalling civilian casualties and no sign of that conflict actually ending. Indeed, the danger is that it could spiral further out of control. You have the terrible worries now manifest all around us of the impact of climate change. You have governments in many countries clawing their way back from the twin crises of the financial crisis and the COVID pandemic. They need stability, they need predictability in the international order. And one of the big changes, I think, from Trump 1, many people might say to me, well, we said lots of these things back when Trump first became president. It didn't turn out quite as badly as all that. The great difference this time is that Mr. Trump appears to be a man to some extent out for revenge. He will not be surrounded, as he was last time, by fairly establishment, regular figures from the Republican, foreign policy circles. He's likely to be surrounded by much more dogmatic, much more ideological people. And for example, in his choice of vice president, a man who parrots Russian propaganda lines, who clearly doesn't want any money at all being spent on Ukraine. So, potentially a very, very different Trump in practical terms than we saw in Trump 1, if you want to call it that.
The diplomatic and defence analyst Jonathan Marcus. A second Donald Trump White House could signal new challenges for Tehran as it remains involved in conflicts in the Middle East. Kasra Naji from the BBC's Persian service joins me now. Kasra, what will Tehran be concerned about?
Tehran, the official line is that it doesn't have any direct bearing on our policies. Our policies are fixed, and as far as the other side is concerned, both of them, as far as we are concerned, both of them are the same ilk, so not much bearing on us in Iran. But I think they're just trying to put a brave face on it. If I were in the shoes of the Iranian leader, I would be very worried.
Yeah, because the Biden administration was widely seen as holding Israel back from strikes on economic targets, even the nuclear facilities in Iran. Is Donald Trump going to show the same restraint?
That's right. The Biden administration generally, with Iran, the emphasis was on diplomacy. With Trump, in the earlier version of Trump of 2016 and so on, he pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement and put maximum pressure on Iran, maximum sanctions and maximum enforcement of sanctions. So that might come back. As far as Israel is concerned, Trump almost certain will give Mr. Netanyahu in Israel free hands in whatever he wants to do, including attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities if it comes to that.
So you're suggesting, really, that Donald Trump's victory does have big implications for the balance of power in the Middle East?
Absolutely. Sanctions will be very damaging to Iran. Iran's economy is already on its knees.
Can the sanctions be turned up anymore?
They can, in terms of enforcement of the sanctions. We know that there are a lot of sanctions on Iran, but a lot of these are not being enforced, particularly oil, for example. A lot of oil is being sold by Iran to China at the moment. That is going to be at risk now, how much Iran exports to China.
And briefly, Iran's proxies, often called proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, they presumably will be taking.
Well, as I say,
a
free hand for Israeli government in whatever he wants to do, Mr. Netanyahu, whether in Gaza or whether vis-a-vis the so-called axis of resistance, all these militias, Hezbollah, Houthis, and others, and Iran itself. So Israel will have the full backing of the U.S. in doing whatever Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. At least that's what it seems at the moment, given the fact that Mr. Trump is generally very unpredictable.
Kasra Naji from the BBC's Persian service, thank you. The re-election of Donald Trump to the White House will no doubt raise an alarm for environmentalists in the United States and far beyond. The president-elect has previously called climate change an expensive hoax and famously pulled America out of the Paris Agreement, a deal drafted to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change. BBC's environment correspondent Matt McGrath joins me now. Matt, what is Mr. Trump's position on climate change and global warming today, and what has he said about it in the past?
That's right, Alex. He's unlikely to have softened his position, shall we say, on action on climate change. He's been a long-term skeptic on climate change and climate action. He's been a booster, if you like, for fossil fuels. And we saw in his previous term, he pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. Because of technical reasons, he wasn't able to really give a force to that until a few months before the end of his presidency. But this time round, if he decides to go down that road again, he'd be able to get the US out within a year. There's a big worry, I think, amongst climate activists and governments around the world that he might go further and take the US out of the UNFCCC. That's the underlying treaty signed in Rio in 1992 and approved by the US Senate, which essentially puts the US at the forefront of all climate actions around the world, that he could go further and take the US out of that. So there are, I think, big worries today about how this will play out in the climate sphere.
So what does this mean for the planet?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think the worry is that Mr. Trump's climate policies are one thing. The other aspect of that are his energy policies. Whether or not he will see or try to boost oil production, whether he'll allow more pipelines, more gas pipelines, encourage drilling in Alaska, something he said he will do.
Drill, baby.
Exactly. This kind of approach, and whether or not there's a market in the world for that. What we have already seen this morning is that his election has seen share prices for wind turbine producers drop because of fears that US commitments on building wind turbines offshore would be changed. So he may have an immediate impact on the share prices of companies where world leaders will be coming next week to Azerbaijan to gather for the next COP, the climate conference, the major climate conference in the world. And, this is where policies are really set. Mr. Trump's team will not be there. It'll be President Biden's team that will be there, but the shadow of Mr. Trump will be over that, and that will have and carry implications for US actions going forward over the next number of years.
Do environmentalists have any reasons to be optimistic?
I think there's some practical reasons here that would indicate that Mr. Trump might temper his policies. For instance, President Biden passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA as it's called, which has put huge money, upwards close to $1 trillion into renewable energy. And an awful lot of that money has gone into Republican areas in the United States. They are unlikely to want to see that act torn up. On the global stage, it's perhaps a more complex picture. The US efforts to boost oil and gas production might run into opposition from other countries. The price mightn't be there to support increased production. But overall, the worry would be is that President Trump's action could add billions of tons of extra carbon to the atmosphere at a time when the world is really on the cusp of significant temperature rises, and action has never been more urgent. So I think the timing in that sense is very difficult to see it as being a good thing for the climate.
Our environment correspondent, Matt McGrath. You're listening to a special edition of the Newsroom from the BBC World Service. The main news, of course, Donald Trump has won a second term in the White House, and his Republican Party has taken the Senate and may retain control of the House. Mr. Trump said he now had an unprecedented mandate and promised immediate action on the economy and migration. His re-election has consequences around the world, with celebrations in Israel, but concern in Ukraine and China. And Donald Trump's return to the presidency will, of course, have a major impact on the Middle East. His re-election has been welcomed at the top of Israeli government, but there's been a cooler reaction elsewhere in the region. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette in Jerusalem, gave me her thoughts.
Noticeably, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel was very quick off the mark in congratulating Donald Trump. And what was also noticeable was that this was not just a political message. It was a very warm, personal one. It was addressed to Donald and Melania Trump and signed off in true friendship, yours, Benjamin and Sarah Netanyahu, underlining that the two couples have in fact built up a very strong personal and indeed political relationship over many years. And it was noticeable too that Prime Minister Netanyahu used almost the same phrase as Viktor Orban of Hungary, another Donald Trump personal and political ally used, talking about history's greatest comeback, exclamation mark. These are two leaders who never hid the fact they very much wanted Donald Trump to be back in the White House. The statement from Prime Minister Netanyahu, as indeed the statement from Israeli opposition leaders, all emphasize this long-standing true friendship between the United States and Israel. That friendship would have endured the strategic partnership that we've seen in full display during the Gaza war and the wider war in the Middle East, whether or not it was Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But there is a sense that that Prime Minister Netanyahu will have an even freer hand now with Donald Trump about to enter the White House. And that was reflected in the opinion polls too, with all the polls showing the vast majority of Israelis believing that Donald Trump would be better for Israel.
And yet a more muted reception from the Palestinians. But the Palestinians, an awful lot of them, we saw it, were making a point of voting against Kamala Harris, those in the United States.
In the United States and here and across the region, there was a lot of indifference. There's been much criticism of President Biden's almost unconditional support for Israel's conduct in the war. And even though in recent months he has been more open in his criticism of the way too many civilians are dying, Kamala Harris was repeatedly calling for a ceasefire, an end to the killing of innocent civilians. But he never used the ultimate weapon that the United States have, and that is to cut off arms supplies or even to suspend them. There was a very temporary suspension early on in the war. So across the region, certainly the view from the streets and some of the Arab leaders was that it doesn't matter who's in power. And in fact, we want to see the Biden team punished for backing Israel to the hilt. But there's a common thread across the reactions we've had so far from the Arab world. The leader of the UAE, the Emir of Qatar, President Sisi of Egypt, Jordan's King Abdullah, all of them emphasize the age-old strategic partnership between their country and the United States. All of them say they hope they can work with the new president, second time in office, to bring peace to the region, to bring about security and stability. They also have their own. They can call up Donald Trump to a particular Gulf state, Saudi Arabia, very close relationship during President Trump's first term. And they will use that pressure too to try to push him away from Israel and to urge him to try to bring an end to this war. And it was interesting how one of the first comments Israeli media picked up on in Trump's speech that he made, which he claimed victory, was he pointed out, he said, I was seen as the man who would start wars, but I'm the man who will stop them. There's certainly a feeling here among the Arabs and the Palestinians, they want him to stop the war in Gaza and in Lebanon.
Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette in Jerusalem. Joined again by our Europe regional editor, Paul Moss, here in the studio. And Paul, I gather there's been more reaction from Russia.
Yeah, a very interesting reaction. Bear in mind, Donald Trump has at times been thought of as rather more sympathetic, shall we say, to Russia than other leaders. He has in the past spoken quite warmly about Vladimir Putin, as we've been hearing, causing all sorts of worries for Ukraine. In fact, the reaction so far from Russia has been rather terse. We've just had this statement from the foreign ministry there saying, we are under no illusions, but will work with Donald Trump. A spokesman said there are no plans for the president, Vladimir Putin, to congratulate Donald Trump. The one person who does seem to be suggesting life will be easier under Donald Trump, with Donald Trump in the White House for Russia, is Dmitry Medvedev, former president, now sits on the Security Council, very hawkish on Ukraine. And he seems to think that Donald Trump is going to be good for Russia. He says Donald Trump dislikes spending money on stupid hanger-on allies or on bad charity projects. He says the Ukraine will fall into the category of people who Trump was most likely will not want to spend money on. So different opinions in Russia, certainly not letting on that they're particularly happy about a Donald Trump presidency, but some of them clearly are.
What's the reaction from the rest of Europe?
Well, everyone's being, of course, very diplomatic. France, Germany, Spain, all of these countries offering their congratulations. But we do know that what European leaders are worried. They're worried about defence spending under Donald Trump because he has made it clear he doesn't want to spend as much money on NATO. He thinks Europe needs to pay for its own defence, as he puts it. They're worried about tariffs. They're very worried because Donald Trump is an unashamed protectionist. His main target is China. He's criticised China for allegedly dumping cheap goods on America. He's promised to impose tariffs there. But he has the same ideas about the European Union. Indeed, he called the European Union a little China. A lot of worries in Europe about tariffs being imposed, particularly on cars. These views came from the streets of Paris, from ordinary French citizens also sharing their concerns.
Gueule de bois, difficile de voir ce résultat. It's like a hangover. It's difficult to see these results. It's going to impact us for the next 4 years and the next French elections. It could impact that too. It's going to give people the wrong ideas.
Maybe we can learn a good lesson from this, that we must strengthen European cohesion and learn to be independent by ourselves and not hide ourselves under the American shield, since Mr. Trump is someone who will be completely unpredictable, just like his policies.
Now, I should say Donald Trump does have his friends in Europe among European leaders. Indeed, we've talked through this whole election campaign about how divided the United States is. Well, you could say that the United States that Europe is as divided between people not explicitly pro-Trump, but certainly in sympathy with some of his views, particularly about immigration, and those who are firmly against it. One of his best allies in Europe is the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. He's always been an outspokenly close friend to Donald Trump. He was one of the first to congratulate Donald Trump on his victory.
He was threatened with prison, his property was taken, they tried to kill him. All the American media turned against him, and yet he won. This is a great encouragement to all who believe in will, in struggle, and in persistence.
Now, note that phrase there, a great encouragement. Viktor Orban means, I think, something fairly specific. As I said, Europe is very divided at the moment, and you have lots of leaders who are in sympathy with these similar views, people like Roberto Fico in Slovakia, the Austrian Freedom Party, which just came out top in the election. They will be hoping that unbalance in Europe will now be settled in their direction.
The Newsroom's Paul Moss. Governments in Central and South America will have been paying close attention to the outcome of the US presidential election. The theme of migration was a big one for both parties, but what could a second Donald Trump administration mean? Our reporter Mimi Swaby told me more.
In every campaign speech, appearance, Donald Trump portrayed immigration as out of control, really villainising and dehumanising migrants, especially migrants from Mexico. He'd also said that migrants from Haiti were eating cats and dogs, as well as other countries grouping people together as this mass who were really invading the country. Immigration, however, is one of the top 3 issues around this election, and both candidates really went in heavily on it. More specifically, one of Donald Trump's key promises now is to execute the largest domestic deportation in the US's history of illegal migrants, really clamping down on migrants, especially those in Mexico, but in the wider region, both Central, South America and beyond.
And border security has always been a very big thing for Donald Trump.
It's been a huge thing. Many people will remember him saying he's going to build a wall between the US and Mexico. Even during the watching party at his HQ in Florida, there were many men dressed in wool suits. This has become a symbol of his presidency and also his stance on the border. He says he wants to fix our country, fix our border. He wants to seal the border and let people come back in, but only legally. And he's going to draw a really hard line on that.
He even threatened Venezuela with military intervention.
Whoever was going to win this election was not going to be a good candidate for Venezuela. Neither candidate represents a bold pro-democracy stance or shift in the country. But sending military to Venezuela is a real escalation of tensions between the US and Venezuela. Trump is thought to perhaps push the pressure, increase the pressure on Nicolas Maduro, who declared victory back in the summer. However, that victory is really heavily disputed over accusations of fraud. Many countries internationally, America and many Latin American countries, have recognised the opposition candidate as the real winner. It's thought that Trump may put more pressure on Maduro, but it's not going to be enough to tip the balance of power. And it's also thought that he could shift towards a deal with Maduro, but in a way that would try and actually harm the opposition's chance of change in the country. So again, yes, a little bit of change, perhaps more pressure, but nothing really substantial, and no sign of any military putting boots on the ground in Venezuela.
What's this going to mean for trade with so many Latin American countries who are such huge trading partners of the United States?
In many South American, Central American countries rely very heavily on trade with the US. And Trump wants to make America great again, but using a lot of American companies, resources, and looking inside the country, perhaps not with Canada, Mexico, who have this far-reaching trade deal, this kind of strategic free trade treaty with the US. It's going to be complicated. There has been very little detail so far what will actually be involved regarding trade, but I think many South American, many Central American countries will be looking on with a lot of concern with regards to trade, as well as many other issues as Trump has declared victory.
Mimi Swaby. So, Donald Trump will be the 47th President of the United States. In his speech to the party faithful in Florida, the president-elect laid out some of his plans for a second term in office.
We're going to have a great 4 years, and we're going to turn our country around, make it something very special. It lost that little thing called special. We have to make it so. We're going to make this so great. It's the greatest country and potentially the greatest country in the world by far. And right now we're going to just work very hard to get all of that back. We're going to make it the best it's ever been. We can do that. If we had to wait longer, I don't know. It was going bad, and it was going bad fast. We're going to have to seal up those borders, and we're going to have to let people come into our country. We want people to come back in, but we have to let them come back in, but they have to come in legally.
Our North America editor, Sarah Smith, assesses the scale of Donald Trump's victory.
It is looking as though there is every possibility that he will have won the White House, the Senate and the House of Representatives, a full sweep, which will give him the opportunity to not only do what he can with his presidential power from the White House, but very possibly pass any legislation he wishes through Congress. It's very unusual for a president to control all branches of government like this, but it appears Donald Trump may very well be able to do that. So when he was saying in his speech there that this is an unprecedented and historic victory, this was for once not hyperbole from Donald Trump. It is absolutely true that he appears to have won a resounding victory. He may very well have won the popular vote as well, which he didn't do in 2016, and America seems to have given him a very clear mandate to enact what he was talking about on the campaign trail, some of which will be quite dramatic.
We've been saying for months, actually, but certainly in the last few days, that it was close, that the polls suggested it would be close. Were the polls wrong, or has it actually been close, but always breaking for him?
I think that's closer to the truth, because although the polls were saying it was, 1% here, 2% there, given the margin of error that there is in most of them of about 3%, it was always entirely possible that they could be roughly correct. But as you say, if everything broke in Donald Trump's favour, then he would be able to sweep all of those swing states. We don't yet know if he has won every single one of the 7 battleground states, although it is looking quite positive for him in each and every single one of them. And of course, it was always possible that he could win the popular vote as well without the polls being desperately wrong. Although that said, in 2016 and in 2020, the other 2 presidential elections in which he ran, the polls did consistently undercount support for Donald Trump. And they said they had adjusted to account for that this time, but it may be that it is difficult for pollsters to get to all the Donald Trump supporters that there are and count them accurately. We'll need to take a little bit of time to dig further into the figures. But yeah, if everything goes his way as it appears it has, he could come out with this really, really very convincing victory.
You have been listening to a special edition of the Newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Alex Ritson. On the day Donald Trump won the US election, he is on course to make a historic return to the White House.
This is the BBC World Service, and in the food chain this week.
For some, it's a rushed sandwich at the desk. For others, it can be the main meal of the day. How do our work habits shape what we eat? I'm Izzy Greenfield, exploring the evolution of the workplace lunch. What's the history of lunch habits across the world, and how are they changing?
The Food Chain, Thursday at 13:30 and 23:30 GMT. In 50 minutes, witness history.
I'm taking you back to the 1970s, when the Shah of Iran threw a 3-day party marking 2,500 years of the Persian Empire. Some say the festival paved the way for his downfall, while others argue the events have been exaggerated to discredit his regime.
Next, it's Outlook. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up on the BBC World Service, Outlook, with me, Asya Fuchs. Allegra Mizrahi was born in Jerusalem in 1938. Her earliest memory is being kidnapped.
For a moment, I'm completely quiet. I don't know what's happened. And then I start to scream. I can feel the scream. And I see him turn round to look at me. And his face is very kind.
Eventually, her mother got her back and smuggled Allegra to Britain. But Allegra always felt out of place, like she didn't quite belong.
I used to climb the trees and hide. But it was the beginning of my hiding who I was.
But she would find her way back. Secrets, betrayal, and a letter tear open Allegra's past. That's after the news.
Hello, I'm Moira Alderson with the BBC News. Donald Trump has completed one of the most remarkable comebacks in political history after securing victory in the US presidential election. He becomes the oldest man to be elected and only the second person to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in the White House. From Washington, here's Sumi Somaskanda.
It truly is remarkable what Donald Trump and his campaign were able to achieve here. You know, we had said for weeks now that the race was tied. It was a toss-up between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And what we kept saying was that caveat that with the polls, it was always within a margin of error. So there was a possibility that you could have one candidate or the other running 3 or 4 points ahead of the other in the final results. And that's exactly what Donald Trump did. But it's not just his ability to win those votes and what it looks like now every swing state, which is truly remarkable. It is also the fact that he was able to build a coalition that expanded on his base.
Alongside the presidential race, Americans have also been voting in congressional elections. Mr. Trump's future control of the levers of government appear to have received a major boost, with the Republicans projected to win back control of the Senate. In the House of Representatives, where all 435 seats were up for grabs, Republicans are also leading. World leaders have been congratulating Donald Trump on his projected victory. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Mr. Trump's return to the White House offered a powerful recommitment to the alliance between Israel and America. China said it would continue to approach bilateral relations based on the principles of mutual respect. The Kremlin indicated there were no plans to congratulate Mr. Trump, referring to the US as an unfriendly country. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said he looked forward to discussing ways to strengthen their 2 countries' strategic partnership. There's also been reaction from other European leaders, as Danny Eberhard reports.
President Macron of France and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz both underlined their willingness to work with Mr. Trump to promote prosperity. Mr. Macron also said he'd spoken to Mr. Scholz of the need for a stronger, more sovereign Europe. Donald Trump's return to power poses many potential problems. Among them are what European countries might do were Mr. Trump to cut military support for Ukraine, his brusque approach to the NATO alliance, the prospect of US tariffs on imports, and stark differences on climate change.
There's been a positive reaction on financial markets to the projected success of Mr. Trump. Here's Katie Silver.
The US dollar has surged as Donald Trump is winning back the White House in the presidential race. The dollar has soared about 1.5% against a host of different currencies, including the pound, euro and the Japanese yen. Bitcoin also hit a record high, topping $75,000. Trump has pledged to make the US the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency capital of the world.
BBC News. The global law enforcement body Interpol says its largest ever operation against human trafficking and migrant smuggling has led to more than 2,500 arrests and the rescue of around 3,000 potential victims. Here's Tom Bailey.
The 6-day operation carried out in September and October saw raids, special deployments and increased flight monitoring take place in over 100 countries and territories across the world. Those rescued included young people forced to work on farms in Argentina, people coerced into working as domestic servants across the Middle East, and victims forced into exploitative pyramid schemes across West and Central Africa. Interpol's Secretary-General Jürgen Stock said it had highlighted the vast scale of the challenge posed by organised crime groups who exploit the vulnerable, and underscored the importance of coordinated global action.
Latest figures show Afghan opium poppy cultivation has risen sharply, though it's still lower than when the Taliban prohibited production 2.5 years ago. The UN Drugs Agency says there remains a window of opportunity to support Afghan farmers to develop sustainable sources of income not linked to illicit markets. South Africa's border authorities have closed the busy Lebombo border crossing with Mozambique after violent protests escalated on Tuesday. They say the closure is due to safety concerns after protesters reportedly blocked roads and torched vehicles and homes. Mozambique has seen unrest following a disputed election won by the ruling Frelimo party. The former Manchester City footballer Benjamin Mendy has won the majority of a claim for wages withheld by the English club while he was facing trial for alleged sex offences. Mr Mendy was cleared of all charges last year. An employment tribunal has now ruled he should be paid most of the more than $14 million in withheld wages. It said that while Mr Mendy was not in custody, he was willing to work. BBC News.
Hi, I'm Asya Fuchs. Can you think back today to your earliest memory? Maybe it was the first family holiday or meeting a new sibling. For my guest, it was this: being kidnapped from her grandmother's garden. She's 3-4 years old, basking in the familiar warmth and tranquility, when suddenly her little world comes crashing down.
I can feel that little girl sitting in the soil, sandy soil, totally absorbed in the insects that move in and out, disappear, reappear. In the background, against the stone house that my grandmother and my mother were in, I could hear them talking to each other. So here I am, with the sun on my shoulders, utterly absorbed in what was going on in my soil universe. I hear the gate click. It's a metal gate, and it's a familiar sound. And when I look up, I see a man walking towards me, and he's wearing white shoes. And I look up and watch him, and he picks me up and takes me out through the gate, and I can feel my legs brushing against the metal gate. And he puts me in the back of a car, shuts the door, gets in, and drives off. And for a moment I'm completely quiet. I don't know what's happened. And then I start to scream. I can feel the scream. And I see him turn round to look at me. And his face is very kind, but I don't know who he is. So we drive for a while and I'm screaming all the time. And he stops very suddenly, and I remember catapulting off the seat onto the floor. So I'm quite quiet for a moment, and then I begin screaming again.
That was Allegra Mizrahi, and today we hear her story. A few years after that kidnapping, when Allegra was still a little girl, she was smuggled out of her country and told to forget who she was. And it was only when she turned 40 that she received a letter that led her back to the life and family she'd lost so long ago. Welcome to Outlook, the the home of extraordinary personal stories on the BBC World Service. Allegra was born in 1938 in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. At this point, and until 1948, the area was controlled by Britain. It was inhabited by a Jewish minority and an Arab majority, as well as other smaller ethnic groups. Allegra's parents were Jewish and had separated soon after she came along. She didn't see much of her father after that, and was raised mostly by her maternal grandmother in Jerusalem. Her next memory after the abduction is sitting in a kibbutz, a kind of socialist, agricultural Jewish community, away from everyone she'd ever known.
I just remember sitting on something that was a table, and I feel the contrast of the firm table against my flesh. And I look at my legs coming out of my pants, and I don't know where I am, and I'm waiting. I'm waiting for my mum to come and get me, or this man to take me back to where he took me from. And time stops. All I remember is food being brought to me, not eating it, and food being taken away again. And I remember kind, gentle people, but I don't know who they were.
At what point do you realize that this man with the kind face and the white shoes who's taken you is actually your father?
Nobody ever told me that he was. I just sort of knew that he was my father.
And what do you think, led him to kidnap you that afternoon in 1941? Why it's quite an extreme act. Why did he do it?
It's a mystery, really, whether he was not allowed to see me because they divorced and my mother got custody of me. So whether he was wanting me, but then why would he put me in a children's kibbutz, which is where he puts in a border kibbutz.
Was this for orphans or just for children of the people who lived there?
Children of the people who lived there, because the parents had to work.
Uh-huh.
Everybody had to work. And so the baby's children were looked after communally.
Right, so you didn't then start living with him?
No, that's what's mystifying about it. He didn't take me home. He put me there, and I don't remember him visiting me. And it was several weeks. Maybe he was hiding me from my mother. Maybe he was punishing my mother. I don't know.
And do you remember being found by your mother several months later?
I don't remember being found. One of the few questions I asked Mummy was, what happened? And she said, East and West doesn't mix, because he was Sephardic and she was Ashkenazi.
And Sephardic are Jews that come from the Middle East,
Middle East.
And Ashkenazi are Jews that come from Eastern Europe.
Yes. And that was a factor at the time, and to some extent still can be. I think I looked like my father, and I think both my mother and my grandmother feared that I would turn out to be like my father. And my mother always told me that he was a bad lot and that he would go to prison. Mm. And that made me feel that I was a bad lot and I might go to prison if I was a bad girl.
Allegra didn't fully grasp what her mother meant. She just sensed it might be easier to avoid talking about her dad altogether. Allegra's mother hadn't had it easy herself. When she was 17, she fled Eastern Prussia to escape the Nazi regime. She and Allegra's grandmother came to Palestine in 1935 on visitors' visas. Most of the rest of her family, including her sisters, would die in the death camps during the Holocaust. Though Allegra's parents' marriage was brief, it was the reason her mom and grandma could remain in the country. After the kidnapping, your mother, somehow, she got you back, and you were taken back to your grandmother's house in Jerusalem. What was your life like?
It was the garden for me. It was sitting on the wall. The wall is still there, the gate is still there. But in the wall there were shards of glass. And I used to climb this wall and sit in between the... I have got so many scars from those shards of glass. But I sat for hours watching the world go by. I was sent to an Arab nursery school.
Did you feel like you fit in? Did you have many friends?
I had Raymond, who was, I think, a Christian Arab, and I had Marianka, who was from Poland, and we played in each other's houses. Marianka's house was very dark, but they had a cupboard with fur coats and things, and we used to dress up. But Raymond's house, it was magic. You went through glass beads that closed over your body as you went in. The smell of the food and the music and the welcome. I just remember being really happy. I loved those two children.
Life began to change for you, for your family, when your mother met a British soldier named Harry. Your mother, your stepfather, and new baby brother moved to these British Army barracks.
Yes.
You stayed behind with your grandmother.
Yes, I was taken to see them quite often.
You started going to a different school. You started going to a British community school.
Yes, I was 7.
You were 7. How did this institution compare to, your life before?
As you ask me the question, I get a sense of being locked up in a cage. I had to wear a uniform, and it was horrible. It was a nice blouse, but it was a green, and I think the cloth was called serge, and it was rough and didn't feel nice, and I didn't feel I looked nice because I was used to wearing shorts. And there was a bus, a green bus with yellow writing on it, and the children were mostly bigger than I was, and they were pale. They weren't like me. They weren't like Raymond and me. I looked like Raymond.
And what was that like? What did you look
They
like?
were light. They had golden hair and green eyes. They weren't like me. Dark skinned and dark hair. And I don't know what they said. I don't know what they were saying. So I felt very alienated. And they wouldn't let me sit down on the bus. The indication was, you're not sitting here, stand up, you're a Jew. And I thought, a Jew? Isn't everybody a Jew? And I was very unhappy in that school.
How did you find out that you and your family, your mother, Harry, her new husband, your new baby brother, were going to leave Palestine?
One day, a lot of big wooden boxes arrived in my grandmother's house, and a little man came with paint, and I remember watching him painting my stepfather's name on it, Major.
On the boxes?
On the boxes. I suppose an address on them as well as his name. And my stepfather kept telling me that we were going home to England, to Kent with England.
Sounded nice.
I was confused about what he meant. Where were we going? Home? But this is home.
Do you remember anything about the day you actually left?
I remember my mother and my grandmother parting, and both of them crying heartbrokenly.
You've described this departure, leaving your homeland. You've described it as a